Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into today's Author Talk series brought to you by the Library Speakers Consortium. The Library Speakers Consortium is a partnership of more than 500 library systems across the US, Canada, and New Zealand with the goal of making author talks more accessible to communities of all sizes. I am Brandon Adler, your host and moderator in conversation with each of the acclaimed authors and presenters that you will hear from throughout our series. Today, we are so excited to have New York Times bestselling author Amanda Montell here to talk to you all about her newest book, The Age of Magical Overthinking, Notes on Modern Irrationality. Got all my tabs ready to go. Welcome, Amanda. Thank you for being here.
Oh my gosh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course. And I know we're ready to dive in. We have a lot of great questions that were pre-submitted. I'm sure we'll get a bunch of great ones live. Let me let everybody know how to do that. So if you want to ask a question now, like I said, we have compiled some pre-submitted questions, but if you want to ask a question at any point during the live event, you can click that questions button just below the live stream video. If you're already in full screen view, you might need to hit the escape button or you won't be able to see those tabs there under the live stream video. There are a lot of you tuning in today, so we'll get to as many questions as time allows. And don't worry if you have to leave early for any reason whatsoever. A link to the recording will go out in about 24 hours to anyone who registered. Now, to formally introduce our guest for today, Amanda Montell is a writer and linguist from Baltimore. She's the author of the acclaimed books Wordslet, Cultish, and The Age of Magical Overthinking, along with hosting the podcast Sounds Like a Cult and now also Magical Overthinkers. Her writing has also appeared in the New York Times, Marie Claire, Cosmopolitan, and more. She holds a degree in linguistics from NYU and lives in Los Angeles with her partner, Plants and Pets. Again, welcome. How are you this afternoon?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you? This is such a delight. This is my first virtual event that I'm doing I just moved into this new home.
Okay.
And I'm proud of my backdrop.
I love your backdrop. It looks very studious and colorful.
Oh, appreciate that very much. Yeah, no, I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I'm coming off of an historic snowstorm. I live in New Orleans. So
oh my God, yeah, you live in New Orleans. So does my whole mom's side of the family. What was there, 8 inches near the airport?
I think so, but in my area, I got 11 and a half.
Brandon,
yeah.
I was seeing someone was skiing down Bourbon Street?
Yeah. It's still New Orleans.
Truly.
The band got out and played on Royal Street and the snow was falling. It looked so magical and beautiful.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Well, extreme weather events are a stressful thing, but I guess sometimes they come with some whimsy. You can always leave it to New Orleans to
find it,
weather that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. How are you doing? How's your area of LA?
I'm safe. It's like psychologically awful to witness so many loved ones lose everything, and the air quality is bad and whatever. But but I'm safe and I'm okay, and I'm grateful. And there's a lot of solidarity in the city right now, which I appreciate. But yeah, I'm okay. Thank you for asking.
Happy to hear that. Well, we have a lot of great questions, so I want to dive in. We have probably one of the most asked questions for any author is how you got your start. So Emma from Serenius H. Booth Library is saying, I'm a huge fan. And this is so exciting to be here. A question I have for the author is as follows. What direction do you see yourself going in as an author, and how did you start writing?
Okay. Well, I was a theater kid as a child. I always loved words and the sort of craft and art of making words entertaining. And when I got to college, I discovered linguistics, which was a discipline that I hadn't heard of before. But as it turned out, I had always my whole life been fascinated by this field that I would learn was called sociolinguistics, which is where language, the science of language and culture intersect, sociology and linguistics, the Venn diagram of those things. And I simultaneously majored in them, minored in creative writing, and I was trying to think of ways that I could combine all three of these loves into a career: the theater aspect, or the sort of like love of entertaining and sharing, that sort of thing, with linguistics, the science of language, with writing, the art of it. And I remember telling people when I was maybe a sophomore, junior, senior in college that I wanted to be a pop linguist and write about linguistics for general audiences. And the reaction to that was, a lot of head scratching. People didn't seem to think that that was viable. So I thought, all right, I'll think of something else. For a while, I thought I maybe wanted to become like a dialect coach on film sets,
Okay.
because I love accents. And that seemed like it might be a cool combination of all three disciplines. But in the end, I was like, maybe not creative enough. Anyway, I decided I would just kind of shelve the linguistic stuff and pursue writing in other capacities. By the time I graduated college, I knew for sure that I wanted to publish nonfiction books. I didn't understand exactly what that would look like for me, but I figured I would just, throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall in terms of writing and see what would stick. And I was delighted that, after sort of a long and circuitous route, once I finally signed with my literary agent and sort of was spewing all the ideas for books that I had, she seemed to think that the language and gender subject that I had studied as a part of my sociolinguistics studies in college seemed to be the best idea for a book. I was surprised and delighted considering all the sort of like meh feedback that I'd gotten about that from everyday people in college. But I was like, great. And so that was the basis for my first book, Word Slut, which is this like quick and dirty crash course in feminist sociolinguistics for everyday readers. And from there, I've just sort of like broadened my horizons, continuing to write about sort of like social sciencey topics or culture specific topics in this kind of like lighthearted and accessible tone. But now I'm actually writing fiction. So that's something that I've always wanted to do as well. I feel like the Age of Magical Overthinking is my favorite thing that I've written. And it really felt like an encapsulation of like everything that I have to say right now as far as nonfiction goes. And so I was able to kind of, feel very satisfied once that book was finished and off to print. And I felt, very, very called to switch genres entirely and start working on a fiction project. So I'm writing this novel now, and it's so beyond delightful. Like I can't even express how much of a fun change of pace that is. So that's kind of the summary.
It's a wonderful summary. Can you tell us anything about maybe genre or anything of the fiction that you're reading?
Sure. So it is a speculative novel. I was really inspired by books like, Ted Chiang's short story, Story of Your Life. That was the basis for the film Arrival, which is about a linguist. I was super, super inspired by that, as well as the new book, The Ministry of Time by Kellyanne Bradley, I think is how you pronounce her name. I just love that book because it's a combination of kind of like sort of sci-fi, but also romance a little bit and history as well. But the tone is so delightful. There's a lot of sort of like lighter-hearted speculative fiction that is inspiring to me. So I decided to start writing this project that takes place in the near future about a genius linguist whose specialization is decryption, cryptography, so deciphering ancient languages, encrypted languages. And she is invited to use her linguistics genius to solve a potentially world-ending problem. I guess that's all I'll say.
That's really exciting.
It's been just like such a delightful creative exercise so far.
I love to hear that. So I'm wondering then, will you continue with kind of your uplifting, humorous tone and voice? I mean, specifically Olivia from Las Vegas, Clark County Library District is saying humor is a powerful tool for discussing heavy topics, but it can also risk undermining the gravity of the subject. How do you navigate that fine line between keeping things humorous and maintaining integrity in the arguments?
Yeah. I write very much how I speak. And so
that's an art in and of itself.
Say again.
So that's an art in and of itself to be able
Oh,
to do that.
I don't think I know how to do anything else. I mean, now that I'm writing fiction, I'm actually having to figure out how to do something else. But I think in the same way that you would navigate that challenge in an everyday conversation, that's how I navigate it on the page. I treat writing as kind of an intimate, you know, exchange with a single reader, and of course I can't possibly account for every single reader or know them or predict the whole complexity of their life. That would be impossible, but I sort of, yeah, I kind of write the way that I would talk to an individual person, with a balance of delight and sensitivity, gravity and levity. And of course, like there's a lot of drafting that goes into this sort of thing, a lot of practice that has gone into it. I did not get the balance right on my first try of my first book by any means. I remember going through a pretty brutal edit process, because when I wrote my first book, I mean, it was the first book that I had ever written. And until that point, I had just, been writing pieces that were published on the internet. My first book was the first thing I'd ever had published in print, which is, a very different medium, that calls for a very different voice. And I remember including a lot of sort of unnecessary, sort of overly self-deprecating jokes that I think undermined kind of my own authority, in the first draft of that first book, which was something that my editor pointed out as, a pattern or a bad habit. I think I was just feeling imposter syndrome and self-consciousness about, like, why did anyone let me write this? And so I was kind of, sort of writing self-consciously, and using humor as a defense, and a tool of self-deprecation in a way that ultimately did not empower the text. So having to kind of overcome some of that imposter syndrome and lean into the notion that, like, I am writing because I have a very specific voice. And, even though there are people who are much more academically decorated than I, they would not be, reaching the same audience with their writing. And so, like, I'm writing for a reason and I have to kind of own that or else not do it at all. And so, yeah, with a lot of practice and also like trusting my own authority and my own sort of like social intuition and sensitivity has gone into striking that balance.
Yeah. So what has been then, Cassandra wants to know, what's been the most challenging part of your research process for these books?
Ooh, the research process is always different. It's different for every single book. So with my first book, Word Slut, that was really a challenge of taking an existing field of study, feminist sociolinguistics, and translating it for general audiences who would not otherwise pick up an academic text about that subject. So that was an act of, I mean, I'll tell you like specifically exactly what I did. I asked my former professor from my sex, gender, and language course in college, which was the course in which I really fell in love with the subject matter. I asked her if she wouldn't mind sending me every syllabus she'd ever taught in that course. And she was kind enough to actually snail mail me a thumb drive containing every article she'd ever assigned. And some of those articles were scholarly, and some of them were more from like trade publications like the New York Times or the Atlantic. And I remember going down like section by section, sort of like chapter by chapter, in each syllabus, reading every single article and like color coding them, and determining, based on what subject matter called the most to me, what I would include in the book. And I almost structured the book like a class syllabus. With some creative license, there's a whole chapter in my book Word Slut on cursing, and there's not one of those in my college class. But I sort of riffed on that idea to structure the book. And it was very intimidating to have to sort of, like decide what of feminist sociolinguistics should be represented in this short text. But I did my very best with it. And I cringe when I read my first book, but I am ultimately proud of it. And it does have like such a darling readership that I value so much. So that research process was very different than Cultish, which is really just a work of cultural commentary. It's kind of like one big long research-based opinion piece. So that involved, again, like reading a lot of primary and secondary sources about cults, but not just cults like Jonestown and Nexium, cults like SoulCycle and Amazon. And so there was just, like a wide range of subject matter that was available to me, as well as conducting like 60 or 70 original interviews with a wide range of sources, from SoulCycle instructors to Jonestown survivors. And as well as my dad, because my dad spent his teenage years in a cult, and his stories, which I grew up on, were kind of the foundational basis for that book. And so, yeah, it was kind of like incorporating investigative reporting that other journalists had done, and putting my spin on it and my cultural commentary on it, and filtering it through my lens of linguistics, because that book is about the language of cults from Scientology to SoulCycle. And then the research process for The Age of Magical Overthinking was totally different still, because this book is so genre blending. It's like, they're kind of essays, but there is like a very strong through line, I feel like, from one to the next, or at least I've tried to infuse one. It's social science based, because every single chapter is dedicated to a different cognitive bias, which I use as a lens to explore some example of modern irrationality, whether we're talking about the extreme cycles of celebrity worship and dethronement that I was noticing, to the like wide embrace of Instagram manifestation gurus during the pandemic. But because this book isn't just a work of, like non-academic sociolinguistics or cultural commentary, it was kind of like just my overthinky brain on a page. I was able to incorporate so many different texts, referencing like a Sylvia Plath poem, and an academic book, or a pop psychology book, like Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me, by Carol Tavris and Elliot Aronson, in the same breath, or in the same paragraph. So that was really cool. And that's kind of my favorite way to think and write. So that research process was different still. And it's fun every time. I like to sort of push beyond what I maybe am really qualified to do with every book that I write.
So you just gave an amazing summary of all of your work, but especially the one that we're here to talk about, The Age of Magical Overthinking. As I understand it, you have a little section marked off to read. Do you want to go ahead and do that now?
Happy to. Yeah, it's kind of like a difficult book to summarize in a nutshell. So I find that if I just kind of read almost the whole entire intro, it's 5 pages, that'll kind of get us all on the same page. Yeah. So I'm going to read the intro to the book. It's called Make It Make Sense, an Intro to Magical Overthinking. The attempts I made to get out of my own head were sundry and full of nonsense. I visited a petting zoo for adults. I tried learning to meditate from a British computer voice. I stocked up on an unregulated nutrition powder called brain dust. My brain felt like dust. In the last few years, dread for no reason became one of my most frequent Google searches, as if the act of typing my feelings to a robot would make them go away. I gorged myself on podcasts about women who'd snapped, at once repulsed and tantalized by those who wore their madness on their sleeves. How good it must feel to snap, I thought. My most cinematic attempt at mental rehab involved picking herbs on a farm in Sicily under a light pollution-free sky. At night here, the stars are so close they could fall into your mouth, the herb farmer told me, sending my heart to my throat. With varying degrees of success, I was doing everything I could think of to defect from the state of overwhelm and consumption that had become my life in the roaring 2020s. Anything to gain some perspective on the mental health exigency I'd been experiencing and trying to rationalize for the better part of a decade. Every generation has its own brand of crisis. Those of the 1960s and 70s were about gaining freedom from physical tyrannies, equal rights and opportunities to vote, learn, work, mobilize. They were crises of the body. But as the century turned, so did our struggles inward. Paradoxically, the more collective progress we made, the more individual malaise we felt. Discourse about our mental unwellness crescendoed. In 2017, Scientific American declared that the nation's mental health had declined since the 1990s, and that suicide rates were at a 30-year high. 4 years later, a CDC survey found that 42% of young people felt so sad or hopeless in the last 2 weeks that they couldn't go about their normal days. The National Alliance on Mental Illness reported that between 2020 and 2021, crisis calls to their lifeline were up 251%. We're living in what they call the information age, but life only seems to be making less sense. We're isolated, listless, burnt out on screens, cutting loved ones out like tumors in the spirit of boundaries, failing to understand other people's choices or even our own. The machine is malfunctioning, and we're trying to think our way out of it. In 1961, Marxist philosopher Frantz Fanon wrote, "Each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it." Our mission, it seems, has to do with the mind. My fixation with modern irrationality took root while I was writing a book about cults. It was 2020, and looking into the mechanics of cult-like influence during that year's existential imbroglio cast new light on the many faces of 21st century derangement. Since the new millennium, humanity had built a megaball full of fun and fresh ways to dissociate. Fringe conspiracy theories had gone mainstream. Celebrity worship reached a hallucinatory zenith. Disney adults and MAGA zealots were blackout drunk on nostalgia, drowned in chimeras of the past. These misbeliefs came in a range of flavors, from whimsical to warlike, but one thing was certain: our shared grasp on reality had slipped. The only explanation for this mass head trip that made any sense to me had to do with cognitive biases, self-deceptive thought patterns that develop due to our brain's imperfect abilities to process information from the world around us. Social scientists have described hundreds of cognitive biases over the last century, though confirmation bias and the sunk cost fallacy were the two that came up the most in my reporting. Perusing just a few of these studies crystallized so much of the zeitgeist's general illogic, like people with master's degrees basing their social calendars on Mercury's position in the cosmos, or our neighbors opting not to get vaccinated because a YouTuber in palazzo pants said it would downgrade their DNA. Cognitive biases also explained scads of my own irrationalities, personal choices I could never justify to myself, like the commitment in my early 20s to stick out a romantic relationship that I knew caused me suffering, or my tendency to engineer online enemies based on conflicts I'd invented. I needed to yank at that thread. I had to understand how these mental magic tricks we play on ourselves combine with information overload like a chemistry experiment gone haywire. Mentos and Diet Coke. Our minds have been fooling themselves since the dawn of human decision-making. The amount of input from the natural world alone was always too much for us to handle. Cataloging the precise color and shape of every twig in order to understand it would take more than a lifetime. So, early brains came up with shortcuts that allowed us to make sense of our environment enough to survive it. The mind has never been perfectly rational, but rather resource rational, say that 5 times fast, aimed at reconciling our finite time, limited memory storage, and distinct craving for events to feel meaningful. Epochs later, the quantity of details to process and decisions to make has exploded like confetti or shrapnel. We can't hope to mull over every data point as deeply as we might like. So we tend to rely on our ancestors' clever cheats, which come so naturally to us, we're almost never aware of them. Faced with a sudden glut of information, cognitive biases cause the modern mind to overthink and underthink the wrong things. We obsess unproductively over the same paranoias. Why did Instagram suggest I follow my toxic ex-boss? Does the universe hate me? But we blitz past complex deliberations that deserve more care. I have more than once experienced the disorientation of engaging in some battle of wits online, only to come up for air and feel in my body like I'd been using sparring tactics better suited to a Neolithic predator than a theoretical conversation. I think because we have come so far technologically in the past 100 years, we think that everything is knowable, but that's both so arrogant and so fucking boring, said Jessica Gross, New York Times opinion columnist and author of Screaming on the Inside in 2023. I've been referring to this era when we're so swiftly outpacing the psychological illusions that once served us as the age of magical overthinking. I'll stop there.
Okay. All right. So you mentioned in when you were talking about research that the through thread for this book was cognitive biases, and you structure each chapter or potentially essay, as you called it, on a different cognitive bias. So how did you decide to do that, and which biases of the hundreds out there to include or not include?
Yes. So as I mentioned in that excerpt, I really began taking a deeper interest in cognitive biases because I was coming across literature about them while researching cult mentality, the motivation to join a group and stay longer than would make sense to anyone else. And confirmation bias and sunk cost fallacy were brought up a lot. Those were two that I had vaguely heard of before, along with zero sum bias. That rang a bell. And so I started to look a little more closely at the research that had been done on cognitive biases. And by the way, cognitive bias is a phrase that was coined by Daniel Kahneman. He's the one who really did a lot of this foundational research on behavioral economics. And I discovered actually this one amazing infographic that sort of depicted all of the cognitive biases that have been described over the decades and divided them by category, each category assigned to a different sort of mental motivation for that bias, whether it be, our limited memory storage or our thirst for meaning, something like that. And that was really eye-opening. It was kind of a crude generalization, but it was a good start. And I saw that there were so many cognitive biases represented on this infographic. So I took a look at them, and my process for choosing the ones to include in the book was kind of intuitive. I kind of treated each bias as like a poetic motif almost. Some of them really jumped out at me just because of their labels. So ones like the IKEA effect or the illusory truth effect. I was like, oh, those sound interesting. So I started looking into dozens and dozens of them, and behavioral economics literature is actually relatively easy to read. Like some of the linguistic studies that I would pour over for my wordlet research really required I was like, okay, I need to drink coffee and really buckle down and focus to read this 10,000 word paper on some phonological concept. There was a lot of jargon. It was just it was challenging to understand, but these behavioral economics papers were immediately fascinating to me. Not necessarily because of the studies that were being done, but because of how quickly I could see how they applied to pop culture concepts. Why is it that when I get a message on Slack that contains a certain word, I instantly enter fight or flight, even though that doesn't make logical sense? Obviously these behavioral economics articles were not mentioning Slack, but I could easily see how it applied. So I chose them. I chose the 11 that I included, and there are more than 11 mentioned, but the key 11 I chose kind of intuitively based on how relevant they seemed to modern irrationalities that were curious to me and that oftentimes aren't really taken seriously or examined through a social science lens. And then I conducted several different interviews with so many different fascinating experts, not only behavioral economists and psychologists, but also folklorists and other experts that were maybe unexpected for a book like this. So it was really cool to be able to treat the subject matter from a creative and also multidisciplinary perspective.
Yeah, you really give everybody a lot to think about, and also a lot of introspection. Is that me that she's talking about?
Yeah, it's definitely me. So I figure if it's me, it's got to be someone else too.
Lewis is saying, could you please talk a bit about the illusory truth effect you explained in chapter 8? Very much a part of many present day realities. The Middle Ages wedding bouquet myth is a lot of fun.
Yes. So the illusory truth effect is this bias that is deceptively simple, but it describes our tendency to mistake something as true just because we've heard it multiple times. It's our proclivity to confuse processing fluency or whether or not a statement rings a bell with accuracy. And I opened the chapter that addresses this cognitive bias with a little anecdote from an episode of my podcast, Sounds Like a Cult. It was the episode on the cult of weddings. And I harbor a certain level of disdain for the sort of like conformist, consumerist attitudes about weddings that exist. I'm planning one myself, and it's frustrating to like kind of get off the conveyor belt that this industry really wants to put you on. So anyway, we were doing this episode on the cult of wedding culture, and I was looking for some justifications for why I feel so icky about so many of the wedding rituals that we're supposed to engage in. And I ended up finding article after article after article that mentioned this factoid that the origin of the bridal bouquet, why brides carry a bouquet down the aisle, is because in the Middle Ages, peasants only bathed once per year. So they would carry a flower bouquet down the aisle to like to mask their tangy stenches before their new husband. And the like popularity of the June wedding was because most of these peasants would take their annual bath in the spring. And so I was just like, I read this in so many different places. It didn't even, well, it occurred to me for a second that it sounded almost too good to be true, but I liked it so much. I liked this factoid so much. And I was like, you know what? I'm gonna share it, And I included some sort of like hedging language when I brought it up on the episode, but it didn't matter. This factoid really spread. It ended up in a viral tweet. Like it was everywhere. And then a medievalist, an actual medieval scholar, ended up tweeting at the podcast and saying like, hey, just a wee fact check here. Almost every piece of lore that you might hear about the Middle Ages is wrong, including this one. And I was like, oh shit. But then I was also like, oh goody. So I got in touch with this medievalist and I interviewed her for this chapter. And I mean, it occurred to me that like I didn't even like really know when the medieval period was. Like I was like, what years are we even talking about here? And our ability to our tendency to overestimate our knowledge of different subjects is also a cognitive bias called overconfidence bias that I do address in this book. But yeah, I ended up sort of my way into this chapter was kind of like fact checking myself and trying to unpack my own horror at my eagerness to spread something that I knew in my bones was probably false, but that I liked so much anyway. I wanted to share it en masse. And as it turns out, there is this phenomenon called the illusory truth effect, and it has really clashed with the information age to produce a problem, an unprecedented problem, because historically, you can imagine a time in human history when if people in your small community were repeating a fact like or a factoid like the red berries over by the stream, like those are poisonous, don't eat them. It was fair to assume that if enough people in your community were stating that, it was something you should probably heed. And if that ended up being false, well, it's okay. It wasn't that big a deal. It was still a good idea to avoid the potentially poisonous berries for survival purposes. And if they weren't poisonous after all, then, whatever, either way. But now that misinformation and disinformation are able to spread so fast and far online, this unconscious, deep-rooted tendency to mistake repeated information as true has become really problematic. And there are other phenomena working alongside the illusory truth effect, such as something called the rhyme is reason effect. It's fascinating to know that like statements that rhyme are interpreted as true more than statements that don't. So studies show that participants would rate the phrase "woes unite foes" as more truthful than "woes unite enemies," just because "woes unite foes" rhymes. We're taking these shortcuts in our minds because we privilege information that is easy to organize, and if it sounds good, if it's catchy in some way, or if we're reading the information, say on Instagram, and it's in a beautiful, highly legible font, then we're more likely to spread that information. And power hungry, influential people can use these cognitive biases that they might not even be aware of on an empirical level, but might be aware of on an intuitive level. They can use them for evil, but also those of us who care about true information can use them for good. So yeah, it was really really fascinating to explore the illusory truth effect and notice how it's taken hold of my brain in moments. And unfortunately, this is one where even an awareness of it might not prevent it from from overtaking your brain. The memory scientist Lisa Fazio has done plenty of research to support that discouraging fact. But we can harness the illusory truth effect to spread true information fast and far online. And so that's helpful, at least.
So Margaret from Timberland Regional Library was suggesting kind of the magical thinking is fatally intertwined with a decline of imperial thinking in the US and beyond, of course. Can you see a future, Margaret's asking, in which critical thinking begins to take precedence? It seems to be that we have gone beyond a point of no return unless we hit rock bottom.
No. These softball questions are just it's just a lovely easy chat. No, I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, it's tough not to feel a little bit fatalistic about the limitations of our minds and how technology is outpacing us. And this phrase, magical overthinking, is again really describing this collision that I feel really is recent between the onslaught of information, this like overwhelm of people and data points that we're confronted with every single day, plus like mass loneliness and isolation, plus this like capitalistic pressure to know everything under the sun and have like the perfect cogent instant take, with these ingrained cognitive biases. There's like this real collision there. And I'm writing not to solve that collision, but at least to bring awareness to it and to reckon with it for myself. And I am not under the impression that like my wee book and I are powerful enough to be able to influence people who are totally resistant to, living in a space of cognitive dissonance, because that's what I'm really hoping to do. Like, again, we are living in this time when there are such incentives to be right, to trade like sanctimony and self-righteousness for power and clout and these things. And those motivations don't really give way to like living in that in between, that like swing between head and heart, between knowing and not knowing. And that being on that dizzying swing is really like where I want to be. And I think that like starting with me is really the best thing. And that's kind of the invitation that I'm hoping to place in the message of this book, is like, I'm hoping with my work to become more compassionate toward other people and more skeptical of myself. And hopefully like I can invite other people to do the same, because Lord knows, we all know at this point that like you can really not use facts to change other people's minds, but you can use facts to change your own mind. And maybe that will be inspiring enough. It's easy to feel hopeless though, because truth and facts don't really, they're not the like chief priority for a lot of people, and they're not always the chief priority for me. Sometimes I am prioritizing community or pathos above facts in a certain situation. So I don't have a crystal ball. Like, I don't know what's going to happen, but I think, having these conversations and, again, being more compassionate toward other people's irrationalities and a willingness to engage with them, while remaining skeptical of yourself. It is so hard. But I'm trying to live this way, and I hope that that start is good enough.
A start is somewhere. And so I think that is good enough. Thank you. Thank you. So you said a couple of things that make me think of the I swear I manifested this chapter, which that whole bias kind of sounds like the cult mentality as well.
Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions about your thoughts on science, having established positive thoughts that are actually good for our health. So Nancy from Kalamazoo Public Library says science has established that positive thoughts are good for our health. Are you saying that we should not offer positive vibes to seriously ill patients? And we had a couple of other questions about related to cancer. It's kind of on the same vein. Lisa is saying, is deeming a belief, assumption, or practice as one following magical thinking a demeaning attribution? If a cancer patient and supporters are told that your positive attitude around the patient does aid the body's healing by the medical community, since the mind-body connection is supported empirically in medical documentation, is the sarcastic deeming of this practice negatively promoting guilt in the patients? How do you feel about that connection?
Yeah. Well, I definitely address the power of optimism and cultivating an optimism practice in the book. I interviewed a fantastic mental health educator and expert named Mina B, who is really emphasizing how beneficial for the mind and body, which are the same thing. I sometimes forget how beneficial that can really be. But when in like an intimate one-on-one interaction, especially with someone who is navigating a life-threatening illness, and I specifically for those who don't have the context, there is a chapter in this book where I talk about a cognitive bias called survivorship bias, which is our tendency to focus selectively on positive outcomes while ignoring the accompanying failures, and how that can warp our perceptions of, successful entrepreneurs or people who survive illnesses like cancer and things like that. And my best friend and my mom are survivors of the same type of cancer or similar type of cancer. So I tell a story about that in this chapter. So I think there's something in between, like, being overly soberly, pessimistically realistic, if that makes any sense at all, with an individual when they're going through something like cancer or a terminal diagnosis, and the sort of like toxic positivity, as I guess it's now colloquially called, of just like, oh, you'll be able to fight and bring yourself out of this. Just have a good attitude. Mukherjee, the brilliant author of books like Emperor of All Maladies, has spoken, very coherently about how, like, a positivity practice will absolutely be beneficial, and maybe even help, although not save your life, upon learning that you have a terminal illness. But like well, sorry, this is why Mukherjee says this and not me. But I include the quote in there. It's something like, a positive attitude like certainly won't hurt. And like, isn't it positive? Aren't there benefits to like enjoying the life you have left, even if it doesn't extend your life? But like, a positive attitude isn't the difference between life or death upon a terminal diagnosis, is I guess the point. And there is some victim blaming and sort of like new age gobbledygook that can accompany notions of like, if you only, like fight and overcome the battle of this illness and really like put your mind to it, then like anything is possible. That's the magical thinking of it. And yes, there are demonstrable benefits to cultivating a positivity practice, or an optimism practice. But if you're given a terminal illness, diagnosis. It's not going to save your life, and sort of like guilting a patient, or especially if they're close to you, into, that's not going to be effective. So I think there's something in between, the optimism and the overt realism. And again, this sort of connects to like the very first question that was asked about like when to use humor and when to use gravity. I think when you're dealing with an individual, it like doesn't matter what the optimism practice studies say, and it doesn't matter what the doctor's prognosis is. It matters like what that human being needs in that moment. And that's just me talking, like that's just something that, that I feel and have gathered just as like a human in the world. Like I relate to the impulse during times of crisis to want to like go to the data, go to the information. What do the positive psychologists have to say? What do the doctors have to say? But sometimes in a moment like that, like it's not about the data. Like it's about what the person in front of you needs.
Yeah, absolutely. We're getting a lot of questions about the halo effect. So I want to move on to that. I noticed that I forgot to switch my blinds, so now there's a light on my face. It's not a halo, but so can you, I guess, talk a little bit about the halo effect? I'm going to ask Navia's question because I think it kind of gets to the heart of the Are You My Mother Taylor Swift chapter. Navia from Hayward Public Library says, one of the most popular phenomena I have seen on TikTok is young stans, as you talk about in the chapter, developing parasocial relationships with celebrities. Think Swifties who will loyally defend Taylor Swift. You talked about all of this in that chapter. Navia is saying, can you talk a bit more to us now about how celebrities play a role in magical thinking? And given that social media is so overstimulating and filled with delusional people, how do you recommend making social media feel like a real place so we can reap its benefits?
Oh my God. I mean, in fairness, I want to say we're all delusional. I do think that the social media feeds delusions. I guess I'll address the last part of that question first. I have no idea how to engage with social media in a way that is grounding. I don't know that it's possible for me. And I have been defecting from social media. I have not only deleted the Instagram app from my phone, I've deleted my web browser applications so that I don't, in like a sort of addict style, go to www.instagram.com in Safari, because I like am so used to that behavior and like need it for my brain chemistry. So I'm really trying to wean myself off of that sort of thing and have absolutely no idea how to engage with it in a way that's healthy and hope I figure it out someday. Or not, or just disappear. But so the halo effect, for those unfamiliar, is the first cognitive bias that I address in the book. And it describes our propensity to admire one quality in a person, like their fashion sense or a song that they wrote, and jump to the conclusion that they must be perfect overall. So yeah, someone enjoys Taylor Swift's Red album and they jump to the conclusion that she must be nurturing, motherly, politically progressive like they are, perhaps, educated about world events. This is happening more and more and more because over the past 20, 30 years, celebrity worship has measurably increased. So I cite some interesting stats in that chapter that like in 1958, Pew Research showed that 3/4, I think it was, of Americans trusted the government to do the right thing almost always or most of the time. Mm-hmm. And then the tumultuous 1960s and 70s happened, the JFK assassination, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, Watergate, like a lot of these really discombobulating events occurred. There was tumult in society. And by the 1980s, that 75% figure had dropped significantly. But we're human beings, and we've always looked to community role models for, how to construct an identity, how to know if we're safe. And how to survive. So the halo effect really is connected to a much more like ancient impulse in human beings, where, you know, say you're living in a much smaller tribal community and you notice a leader, or someone in the group who is, you know, like beefy, has big muscles, and has intact teeth. You might jump to the imperfect but good enough conclusion that they must be, you know, really a strong fighter, and thus they've avoided disfigurement from battle, and a skilled hunter, and that's why they were able to eat meat and grow big muscles. Who knows if any of those things were true, but it was a good enough conclusion to jump to. And thus you might say, I want to align with that person for survival. We're now mapping those instincts onto these parasocial relationships with celebrities. This is a dynamic that, like, we did not evolve for, and our minds and bodies have not caught up to being able to distinguish someone that we feel that we know really, really well on a screen from someone that we actually know in real life, much less being able to, you know, like stymie the effects of the halo effect when engaging in that parasocial dynamic. So we're increasingly looking to celebrities rather than community authorities, government leaders, etc., to be our role models. We're jumping to conclusions that they are not just pop stars, but saviors. You know, like, how many of us have entered some kind of tchotchke establishment and seen the like prayer candles with Harry Styles on the cover, like Saint Dolly Parton, Saint Harry Styles, Saint Taylor? I see them. It'll be like the head of Taylor Swift on the body of Jesus. And I'm like, that's all we need to know. You know, like, that's where we're at. We're looking for someone to save us during a time of tumult. And celebrities are increasingly filling that role as traditional religion is declining, trust in the government is declining. And yeah, I'm not entirely sure, like, I have a solution. But again, I think it is a matter of like becoming aware of these invisible and unconscious cognitive biases and seeing how they show up in our own lives. For me, like, I have definitely jumped to the conclusion that like certain authors whose books I admired like agreed with me about politics or whatever, and then that even though there was no evidence to demonstrate that that was true, and then I'll see them post something on social media that like violate, it feels like a deep betrayal of some conclusion that I jumped to in my own head. I don't know them, they don't know me. And have you ever witnessed this type of interaction where like a fan of someone will, you know, see a post of the celebrity or the author that they admire that irks them or that violates some conclusion that they had jumped to about that person, and they'll go to the comments. This is a perfect stranger. They'll go to the comments and be like, so and so, I am so disappointed in this post, unfollowing. It's like a parasocial breakup, if you will, that's like totally one-sided. And I've come across some funny tweets and stuff that say things like, you know, this like blah, 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 this isn't an airport, you don't need to announce your departure, to people who like comment things like that. But it's like, if you're going through a parasocial breakup, it feels so disorienting to just like disappear from the life of this person that you've admired so much, because normally in a breakup scenario, there's like a face-to-face interaction or at least a phone call, and there's maybe crying, and it feels like satisfying socially. But a parasocial breakup doesn't feel that way, so people flock to these comments to be like, you've disappointed me, I'm unfollowing. And then the celebrity's like, okay, like, I don't care. Like, I don't know you, and this doesn't make sense, and like, I have not betrayed you. Like, I don't know why you thought anything else about me, but it's because of the halo effect. And so I mean, I've been there. Like, I've been disappointed by things that my favorite celebrities have posted, but it's just an invitation to reflect on my own biases and my own expectations. And, you know, maybe celebrities are not here to save us after all.
So much of the book, you're talking about overthinking and these things that we overthink about, but I think maybe also pointing out kind of underthinking on more important things. So Kelly Grace is saying, what causes overthinking? How can we make it stop? But on the opposite end of that, Jeff is pointing out magical underthinking could have also been an accurate title. So can you talk a little bit about overthinking and underthinking as kind of what you're getting to the point of the book there?
Yes. Well, I think the root of it is just it's become increasingly difficult to determine in this ever disembodied age, what is actually a threat, and what actually needs and deserves our attention. So I mentioned that thing earlier about like receiving a message on Slack and thinking it was a predator in the bushes. Like that's how my body responded to it. But then like reading a headline about some very complex societal matter and being like, yeah, I get it. So it's because we are mapping our cognitive biases that emerged to help us survive in a physical world onto abstract problems. And that is really scrambling our overthinking and our underthinking. So, let's say you're scrolling through Instagram and you see, your ex, like watching all of your Instagram stories. You might spiral in the style of a conspiracy theorist, because because there is a cognitive bias called proportionality bias at play, and you're like which evolved for a certain reason, but now you're displacing it onto this social but non-social, like Instagram mediated non-interaction. And we don't know that we do this. Like we don't know that we have these biases in us, that are like causing us to spin out over things that don't demand spinning out. And yet at the very same time, certain cognitive biases will cause us to oversimplify complex matters, that really deserve more attention. Like, when your confirmation bias takes over as you're reading a news article and you're like, oh, this news article is saying that, so-and-so attacked so-and-so and that person is an enemy. And it's like, I don't know, like it's a little bit more complicated than that. It's just that your confirmation bias caused you only to seek out and read and remember the things that validated your existing beliefs. So I think that these cognitive biases are just like mismatched with our culture at the moment. And sometimes they work totally fine, just as they always have. And sometimes they are good for survival in the ways that they always have been. But I think these cognitive biases are at their best when we're engaging in the physical world we're meant for. And I love that the phrase like touch grass has become so diffuse, because it's really speaking to the heart of something that is quite true, which is that like our minds and bodies, again, which are the same thing, are really good at contending with the physical world, and not as good at contending with this extremely overwhelming, disembodied, complicated, abstract digital world. And just being aware of those limitations can be helpful. Also, because like if you are spinning out and overthinking about something that cannot be cured with overthinking, re-engaging with the physical world sounds so simple and so sort of corny, but like, engaging with a physical practice like knitting. Like I came across this really great study that I included in a footnote in this book, that like knitting was found to decrease signs of depression in depressive patients. Knitting or like walking in nature is shown to slow down time. Like these things that are so deceptively simple, actually have an incredibly positive impact on our overthinking tendencies these days.
Mm-hmm. So we have so many great questions left, but we're kind of at the end of the hour. I do want to quickly ask, because we had a high school book club submit their question, and they just said, could you share any advice? It's from Geneva High School Book Club. Could you share any advice for young writers, specifically those interested in transitioning from writing for school to writing for themselves?
Ooh, I love that question. One reason why I really couldn't go into academia is because my mentor, well, my would-be mentors in the linguistics department were really gonna drive my voiciness out of my writing, and I didn't want that to happen, because that's my favorite part. So I would say, after you graduate from high school and you don't have to abide by the sort of strict, 5-paragraph essay standard, this is where your thesis statement goes, and you're not supposed to, use I opinions in the piece or whatever, after you can sort of like discard those standards, I might just like start experimenting with different formats. The concept of my first book, Word Slut, really came out of some like super cringy YouTube videos I was making when I was like 23, 24. And that was a great exercise because speaking and like making videos rather than writing was a much more sort of like colloquial practice, and really got me used to translating complicated concepts for an internet audience. And then of course when I started translating that into book form, I had to formalize it and again like get rid of those jokes that were excessive and stuff. But yeah, I would definitely say like feel free to experiment in different mediums, and just to figure out what it is that you want to say and how it is that you want to say it. And I am so cringed out by the writing and the other styles of content that I made when I was younger. Oh my God. But if you can sort of stomach the cringe, a project has to be cringe before it can be good.
Yeah.
So if you can like handle that, I advise you to just know that it's not just you, it's everyone. That you'll be well on your way to figuring out your voice and the message that you might want to communicate.
Excellent advice. Okay, I know that I lied. I am going to ask one more. What are you reading right now that everybody needs to run to the library and check out immediately?
Ooh, okay. Well, sometimes I read books that I don't know that everybody should read. I'm about to start reading the book Orbital by Samantha Harvey, because that's like that sort of speculative world that I'm writing in now with fiction. And then a book that I didn't just read, but I think that everybody should go out and read, is Ted Chiang's short story collection, Story of Your Life, which is the basis for the movie Arrival. And that Ted Chiang's short story, Story of Your Life, which is about like a linguist who saves the world, was like very much an inspiration for me. So it's super, super brilliant. And I think if you like my work, oh man, Ted Chiang is like a brilliant genius freak who like, I wish I could enter his mind for a second, but yeah, I would say that.
Well, we are all looking forward to reading your novel when that comes out. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's truly been a pleasure to talk to you for the last hour. Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, the pleasure is all mine. I'm so just like honored and humbled to be here and answering everybody's questions. Thank you all so much for being here.
Yeah, and I want to echo that as well. Thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So we thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. As a reminder, if you scroll down below the live stream video, you'll see a resources area, and that area contains a link to Amanda's book, The Age of Magical Overthinking. We look forward to everyone joining us next week on January 28th when we talk with literary agent Seth Fishman as he gives everyone an inside look at working with a literary agent. Be sure to register for this and lots of other great events on your library's event page. I'm Brandon Adler. Thank you for joining us.